Colorado Territory, 1874. Colton Vance reckoned the thunderheads gathering over the western ridge mirrored the storm that had become his life. The 25-year-old cowboy adjusted his Stetson against the rising wind, his lean frame tense in the saddle as he guided his chestnut stallion down the slope toward the small town of Timber Creek. The war had taken his father, outlaws had taken his mother and sister, and the harsh frontier had taken his faith in anything resembling goodness. Each tragedy had wrapped another layer of thorns around his heart until he'd convinced himself that the only reliable companion was the Colt revolver on his hip. The only love worth pursuing was for the land itself, silent, demanding, but incapable of the betrayal that came with human attachment. No sense in fooling yourself, boy, his trail boss had told him just last week after catching Colton staring too long at a young woman in town. Men like us don't get happy endings. We're meant to ride alone. Colton had nodded, accepting the wisdom. What he wanted was simple: enough work to keep his belly full and his horse fed, enough distance from others to keep the pain at bay. He'd been chasing that solitary dream across 3 territories, never staying in one place long enough for roots to form. The town of Timber Creek was supposed to be just another way station, a place to stock up on supplies before moving on to the next ranch, the next cattle drive, the next lonely stretch of trail. He'd heard they needed help at the Henderson place outside of town. Good honest work breaking horses, the kind of job where a man could lose himself in sweat and struggle rather than memory. The first fat raindrops began to fall as Colton reached the outskirts of town. He spurred his horse toward the general store, hoping to secure supplies before the deluge truly began. As he approached, he noticed a woman struggling with several large packages on the boardwalk, her arms laden with supplies that threatened to topple as the wind gusted. In that moment, the heavens opened. Rain poured down in sheets, and a particularly strong gust sent one of the woman's parcels tumbling into the muddy street. Without thinking, Colton dismounted in one fluid motion, snatching the package before it could be ruined in the mud. "Ma'am," he said, extending the rescued parcel toward her while keeping his eyes respectfully lowered. When he finally looked up, the breath caught in his throat. Beneath a hastily raised shawl, a pair of striking blue eyes regarded him with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. She was young, perhaps 22, with honey blonde hair partially escaping from beneath a modest bonnet. Her dress, a simple blue calico that matched her eyes, was already darkening with raindrops. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice soft yet carrying easily over the drumming of the rain. "I'm afraid I was rather ambitious with my purchases today." "Allow me," Colton offered, surprising himself with the words. He rarely engaged with strangers, especially not beautiful young women who stirred uncomfortable feelings in his chest. Yet here he was, gathering her packages in his arms. "Where might you be headed?" "The millinery shop just down the street," she replied, gesturing with her chin toward a storefront with a hat displayed in the window. "I'm Beatrice Thornton. Most folks call me B." "Colton Vance," he replied. "New to town." Something flickered in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps. "Mrs. Thornton," she corrected gently, though I'm afraid that title's more honorary than actual these days. The significance wasn't lost on him. A widow then. Her youth made the realization all the more poignant. The war or the frontier, one or the other claimed so many men before their time. They reached the millinery shop, ducking inside as thunder cracked overhead. The shop was empty save for an elderly woman dozing in a chair by the counter. "My aunt," Beatrice explained, noticing Colton's glance. "She lets me use the back room as living quarters. I help with the shop in return." As he set the packages down on the counter, their hands brushed momentarily. The simple contact sent an unexpected jolt through him, and Colton pulled away as though burned. "Much obliged for your help, Mr. Vance," she said, studying him with those penetrating blue eyes that seemed to see right through his carefully constructed barriers. "Not many would stop in a downpour like this. Just happened to be in the right place," he mumbled, suddenly eager to escape the small shop with its lingering scent of lavender. Her scent, he realized. "Good day, Mrs. Thornton." Outside, the rain continued to fall, but Colton hardly noticed as he remounted and continued toward the saloon where he hoped to find information about the Henderson Ranch. The brief encounter had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. There had been something in those blue eyes, a resilience, a quiet strength that spoke of someone who had faced loss and continued standing. Not unlike himself, perhaps, though Beatrice Thornton seemed to have retained something he'd long since abandoned, hope. 3 days later, Colton found himself breaking horses at the Henderson Ranch. The work suited him, demanding every ounce of concentration, leaving no room for wayward thoughts. Yet in quiet moments, unbidden, his mind would drift to blue eyes and honey-blonde hair. "You're good with those Mustangs," Jacob Henderson commented as Colton dismounted from a particularly spirited pinto he'd just ridden to submission. "Most men would have been thrown 10 times by now." Colton shrugged, removing his gloves. "Horse and man ain't so different. Both just want to know where they stand." The rancher nodded thoughtfully. "Say, we're having a few folks over for supper Sunday next. Nothing fancy, just neighbors breaking bread. You should join us." Colton's instinct was immediate refusal. Social gatherings meant questions, expectations, the possibility of attachments he couldn't afford. "Appreciate the offer, but the widow Thornton will be there," Henderson added, a knowing look crossing his weathered face. "She does some sewing for my wife. Fine young woman. Shame about her husband. Killed by Apache raiders not 6 months after their wedding. Been on her own these past 2 years." The mention of Beatrice sent an unwelcome warmth through Colton's chest. He silently cursed the small-town telegraph that had clearly been at work. His brief encounter with the widow hadn't gone unnoticed. "I'll consider it," he said noncommittally, turning back to the corral where another wild Mustang awaited his attention. But the seed had been planted. As much as he tried to focus on the dangerous work of breaking horses, his thoughts repeatedly wandered to Beatrice Thornton and what circumstances might have brought a young widow to this remote corner of the territory. Sunday arrived crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that showcased the frontier at its finest. Golden light bathed the distant mountains, and the air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke. Against his better judgment, Colton found himself cleaning up as best he could, donning his least-worn shirt, and making his way toward the Henderson Ranch house. The gathering was already underway when he arrived, with a dozen or so neighbors congregated on the wide porch. He spotted her immediately. Beatrice stood near the railing, engaged in conversation with Mrs. Henderson. She wore a simple dress of sage green that complemented her fair complexion, her blonde hair arranged in a modest knot at the nape of her neck. When she glanced up and saw him, a smile touched her lips, a genuine smile that reached her eyes and momentarily stopped the breath in Colton's lungs. He nodded in greeting, feeling suddenly and acutely out of place among these settled folk with their easy familiarity. "Mr. Vance," she said as he approached, "how pleasant to see you again." "Mrs. Thornton," he replied, removing his hat. "You're looking well." Mrs. Henderson beamed between them. "You two are already acquainted? Wonderful. B, perhaps you can convince our new horsebreaker to stay in Timber Creek. Jacob says he's the best he's seen in years." Beatrice's cheeks colored slightly. "I'm sure Mr. Vance has his own plans, Martha. Not everyone is meant to put down roots." There was something in her tone, a resignation, perhaps, that suggested she understood the transient nature of frontier life all too well. Before Colton could respond, dinner was announced, and the gathering moved inside to a table laden with roast chicken, potatoes, and fresh-baked bread. Through some manipulation that could only be the work of Mrs. Henderson, Colton found himself seated beside Beatrice. Throughout the meal, he was acutely aware of her presence. The delicate way she handled her cutlery, the soft cadence of her voice as she conversed with those around her, the subtle floral scent that seemed to envelop her. "What brings you to Timber Creek, Mr. Vance?" she asked during a lull in the conversation. Most passed through on their way to Denver or the mining towns. Colton hesitated. The truth, that he was simply drifting, avoiding attachment, running from memories, seemed too revealing. "Work," he said simply. "I go where the horses need breaking." She studied him for a moment. "And before that?" "Texas, mainly. Some time in Kansas." He shifted uncomfortably. "And you? You're not originally from here, I'd wager." "Missouri," she replied. "My husband Thomas and I came west after the war. He had dreams of starting a ranch." Her eyes took on a faraway look. "After he was killed, I stayed on. I've nowhere else to go, really." The naked honesty of her statement struck him. Here was someone who understood loss, who had faced the brutal reality of frontier life, and chosen to endure rather than flee. It was a courage he hadn't been able to muster himself. After dinner, as the gathering spilled back onto the porch to enjoy the evening air, Colton found himself walking alongside Beatrice, slightly removed from the others. "They mean well," she said softly, nodding toward the Hendersons who kept casting glances their way. "The matchmaking is rather transparent, I'm afraid." Colton felt heat rise to his face. "I noticed. I should warn you," she continued, her voice taking on an edge of humor, "that once Martha Henderson decides two people should be acquainted, resistance is rather futile." Despite himself, Colton smiled, the first genuine smile to cross his face in longer than he could remember. "Sounds dangerous. Terrifying," she agreed with mock solemnity. Then, more seriously, "But sometimes it's good to be pushed beyond our comfortable fences." Their eyes met, and in that moment, Colton felt something shift inside him, a small crack in the thorny barrier he'd constructed around his heart. Before he could respond, a commotion arose from the yard. A rider was approaching at speed, his horse lathered and blowing hard. "Raiders!" the man shouted as he dismounted. "Hitting the Parson place. They've set fire to the barn." The peaceful gathering dissolved into urgent action. Men rushed for horses and weapons, while women gathered children and prepared bandages. Colton moved instinctively toward his horse. "I'm coming too," Beatrice said firmly, gathering her skirts. When Colton opened his mouth to protest, she cut him off. "I have medical training. They'll need it." There was no time to argue. Minutes later, they were riding hard toward the Parson homestead, part of a group of 10 men and Beatrice. The glow of the fire was visible from miles away, a malevolent orange stain against the darkening sky. The raiders, a mix of renegades and desperate men by the looks of them, were already retreating as the group from the Henderson place arrived. The barn was fully engulfed, and John Parson lay wounded on the ground, his wife trying desperately to staunch the bleeding from a bullet wound in his shoulder. Beatrice dismounted before her horse had fully stopped, rushing to Mrs. Parson's side with steady hands and calm words. Colton watched in amazement as she took control of the situation, directing the men to fetch water and supplies while she attended to Parson's wound with practiced efficiency. "This isn't her first time dealing with violence," Henderson murmured, coming to stand beside Colton as they watched Beatrice work. "When her husband was killed, she was the one who patched up the survivors of the raid. Learned medicine from her father, I hear." The night stretched long as they fought the fire and tended the wounded. Throughout it all, Beatrice worked tirelessly, her calm demeanor never faltering. Colton found himself repeatedly at her side, following her quiet instructions, admiring her strength even as it challenged everything he believed about frontier life and those who survived it. Dawn was breaking when they finally returned to the Henderson ranch, exhausted and smoke-stained. Parson would live. His homestead was damaged but salvageable, and the raiders had been driven off without further bloodshed. As they dismounted, Colton noticed Beatrice sway slightly with fatigue. Without thinking, he reached out to steady her, his hand catching her elbow. "Thank you," she murmured, looking up at him with eyes rimmed red from smoke and exhaustion. "I didn't realize how tired I was." "You were remarkable tonight," he said honestly. "I've never seen anyone so calm in the face of chaos." A sad smile touched her lips. "Practice makes perfect, Mr. Vance. The frontier teaches harsh lessons." As he helped her up the steps to the ranch house, Colton realized with startling clarity that Beatrice Thornton embodied everything he had been running from, and perhaps everything he had been seeking without knowing it. Her strength didn't come from isolation or emotional walls, but from facing loss head-on and choosing to remain open to life despite its cruelties. The realization was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. In the weeks that followed, Colton found himself drawn into the orbit of Timber Creek in ways he'd never anticipated. The Henderson Ranch provided steady work, and increasingly, he found reasons to ride into town. Sometimes he claimed to need supplies. Other times he admitted to himself that he simply hoped to catch a glimpse of Beatrice at the millinery shop. Their encounters grew more frequent, less coincidental. He found himself waiting outside the church on Sundays, offering to carry her packages after services. She began to bring him lunch at the ranch sometimes, claiming Mrs. Henderson had sent her with extra food that would otherwise go to waste. With each meeting, The thorny barriers around Colton's heart receded just a little more. He found himself sharing small pieces of his past, his childhood in Texas, his father's death at Antietam, the outlaw raid that had taken his mother and sister while he was away looking for work. I should have been there to protect them, he confessed one autumn afternoon as they sat on the bank of the creek that gave the town its name. That's why I don't stay anywhere too long. Everyone I've ever cared for has been taken. Beatrice's hand found his, her touch gentle but firm. You can't outrun fate by keeping everyone at arm's length, Colton. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and the sound of it on her lips sent warmth coursing through him. When Thomas was killed, she continued, I wanted to build walls too. To never let myself care for anyone again. She looked out over the water, sunlight dancing on its surface. But then I realized that would mean the raiders had taken not just my husband, but my capacity for love as well. I refused to give them that power over me. Her words struck him deeply, challenging the beliefs he'd built his solitary existence upon. What if his isolation wasn't protection, but surrender? What if, in trying to avoid more pain, he was allowing those who had hurt him to continue taking from him long after they were gone? As autumn deepened into winter, Colton found himself for the first time in years considering a future beyond the next job, the next town. He began repairs on a small cabin at the edge of Henderson's property, telling himself it was just to have shelter for the winter, but knowing in his heart it was more. The first snow came early that year, blanketing Timber Creek in pristine white. Colton rode into town with a purpose, a small package carefully tucked inside his coat. He found Beatrice at the millinery shop, helping her aunt arrange a display of winter bonnets. Mrs. Thornton, he said formally, aware of her aunt's curious gaze. I wonder if I might have a word. Beatrice looked up, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. Of course, Mr. Vance. Aunt Mabel, would you mind if I step outside for a moment? The older woman waved them off with a knowing smile. Take your time, dear. Outside, the snow continued to fall in gentle flakes that caught in Beatrice's hair like tiny stars. Colton led her to the covered portion of the boardwalk, where they could speak privately. I have something for you, he said, suddenly feeling awkward and young despite his 25 years. He withdrew the package and handed it to her. It's not much, but Beatrice unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small carved wooden horse, its lines simple but elegant. You made this? She asked, turning it over in her hands. Colton nodded. My father taught me. Said a man should be able to create beauty as well as utility. He cleared his throat. I wanted to ask if you might join me for dinner. At my cabin. I've been fixing it up, and, yes, she interrupted, her blue eyes bright with emotion. I would like that very much. The evening of their dinner arrived clear and cold, with stars pricking the black velvet sky like diamonds. Colton had spent days preparing the cabin, repairing the roof, sealing drafts, scrubbing every surface until it gleamed. He'd ridden 20 miles to the next town for proper dinnerware and linens, determined to offer Beatrice something beyond trail food on tin plates. When Henderson's wagon delivered her to his door, propriety demanded a chaperone for the journey, though the rancher tactfully departed immediately. Colton felt his heart swell at the sight of her. She wore a dress of deep burgundy, her honey blonde hair arranged with more care than usual, adorned with a simple ribbon. Your home is lovely, she said as he showed her inside, where a fire blazed cheerfully in the hearth, and the table was set with his new purchases and sprigs of evergreen. It's still rough, he apologized, suddenly seeing every flaw through her eyes. But it's coming along. It feels warm, she said, meeting his gaze directly. Like somewhere a person could belong. The simple dinner, venison stew, fresh bread he'd traded for, and apple pie from Mrs. Henderson, became one of the most meaningful meals of Colton's life. They talked for hours, the conversation flowing more easily than he'd ever experienced. Beatrice spoke of her dreams for a small school in Timber Creek, of her love for the mountains, of her hope that the frontier would someday be a place where beauty could flourish alongside strength. As the evening drew to a close, with the fire burning low, Colton found himself standing close to her near the hearth, acutely aware of her presence, the subtle rise and fall of her breath. I should take you back soon, he said reluctantly. People will talk if you're gone too long. Beatrice smiled up at him. People are already talking, Colton Vance. Small towns run on gossip like engines run on steam. And does that bother you? He asked, suddenly uncertain. The talk. She shook her head. What bothers me is wondering if you'll still be here come spring. Her hand reached up to touch his face gently. If all this, the cabin, tonight, is just a temporary shelter before you move on again. The question pierced straight to the heart of his fear. The urge to retreat, to protect himself from potential loss, rose strongly within him. Yet looking into her eyes, Colton found something stronger than fear. The possibility of a happiness he'd convinced himself was forever beyond his reach. I can't promise the future is certain, he said honestly. The frontier makes fools of those who take too much for granted. But I can promise that for the first time since I can remember, I want to stay. To build something lasting. He took her hand in his. With you, if you'd allow it. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question asked and answered in the language of touch. When they finally parted, Beatrice's eyes shone with unshed tears and a hope that mirrored his own. I should warn you, she whispered. Loving someone on the frontier is an act of courage. Every day brings uncertainty. Colton smiled, feeling a weight lifting from his shoulders. I'm beginning to think that's true everywhere, Mrs. Thornton. The difference is whether we face that uncertainty alone or together. As promised, he returned her to town that night, already counting the hours until he could see her again. For the first time in years, Colton rode back to his cabin not with the restless energy of a man preparing to flee, but with the purposeful determination of a man building a foundation. Spring came to Timber Creek in a riot of wildflowers and new growth. The Henderson Ranch prospered, and Colton's reputation as a horsebreaker spread throughout the territory. But the greatest transformation occurred within Colton himself. The man who had arrived last autumn, guarded, solitary, ready to drift on at the first sign of attachment, had been replaced by one who greeted neighbors by name, who attended church services regularly, who spoke of future harvests and building projects. The source of this change was no mystery to anyone in Timber Creek. Colton and Beatrice were seen together frequently, riding across the Henderson property, walking along the creek, sitting side by side at community gatherings. Their courtship progressed with a measured pace that respected her widowhood while acknowledging the deepening bonds between them. Then, on a warm May afternoon, as they rode along a ridge overlooking the valley, disaster struck without warning. The gunshot came from the trees to their left, a single report that sent birds scattering. Colton's horse reared in panic, nearly throwing him. As he fought to control the animal, he saw Beatrice clutch at her side, blood blooming like a crimson flower on her pale blue riding skirt. "Bee!" he shouted, dismounting in an instant and catching her as she slipped from her saddle. More shots rang out. Colton dragged her behind a boulder for cover, his heart hammering as he assessed her wound. The bullet had grazed her ribs, painful and bleeding freely, but not immediately life-threatening if he could get her to safety. "Raiders," she gasped, her face contorted with pain. "No," Colton growled, recognizing the methodical approach of their attackers moving through the trees. "These men are hunting, not raiding." Recognition dawned in her eyes. "Someone's after you." Before he could respond, a voice called from the trees. "Vance, I know that's you. Send out the woman, and we'll let her live." Colton went cold. He knew that voice. Silas Madden, the vicious right hand of the outlaw gang that had murdered his family. The very men he'd tracked halfway across Texas before abandoning his quest for vengeance, convinced it would only lead to his own death or damnation. "How many?" Beatrice whispered, pressing a handkerchief to her wound. "3, maybe 4, he answered, checking his revolver. He had a rifle still in its scabbard on his horse, but the animal had bolted down the slope. "B, listen to me. I need you to stay here while I draw them off." Her hand clutched his arm with surprising strength. "No. Whatever's happening, we face it together." "You don't understand," he said urgently. "These men, they're from my past. The gang that killed my family. I tracked them for months before I gave up the hunt." Shame washed over him. "I should have seen this coming. Should have known my presence here would eventually bring danger." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "This is why you never stayed anywhere long. Not just to avoid attachment, but to protect others from your past." Another shot ricocheted off the boulder, sending stone fragments flying. "Last chance, Vance," Madden called. "We know about your pretty widow. Would be a shame if she ended up like your sister." White-hot rage surged through Colton. "Stay here," he told Beatrice, His voice hardened with resolve. "When I draw them away, make for the Henderson Ranch. It's less than a mile down the valley." Colton, no. But he was already moving, staying low as he circled around the boulder to approach from an angle the outlaws wouldn't expect. He fired twice into the trees, gratified to hear a cry of pain in response. "You want me, Madden?" he shouted. "Come and get me." He broke cover, running toward a cluster of rocks further up the ridge. Bullets kicked up dirt around his feet, but he reached the position unharmed. From his new vantage point, he could see 3 men spread out among the trees, Madden and 2 others he didn't recognize. The firefight that ensued was brief but intense. Colton managed to wound one of the unknown men, but found himself pinned down as the outlaws closed in. His ammunition was running low, and the exposed position left him few options for retreat. As he prepared for what might be his last stand, a shot rang out from an unexpected direction. One of the outlaws cried out, clutching his leg as he fell. Colton risked a glance back toward the boulder, and his heart nearly stopped. Beatrice had retrieved his rifle from his horse, which must have returned to the area. She had positioned herself on higher ground and was aiming with steady hands that belied her injury. "She's armed," Madden shouted to his remaining companion. "Take her out." The distraction gave Colton the opening he needed. He broke from cover, firing his remaining bullets at Madden even as he raced toward Beatrice's position. The outlaw leader dove for cover, but not before one of Colton's shots found its mark in his shoulder. Reaching Beatrice, Colton grabbed her arm. "We need to run now." Together they fled down the ridge toward the valley, the remaining outlaws in pursuit, but slowed by their wounded companions. The Henderson Ranch came into view just as Colton's strength began to flag, the adrenaline that had sustained him starting to ebb. "Almost there," Beatrice encouraged, her own face pale from blood loss and exertion. Shots from the ranch house signaled that their plight had been noticed. Henderson and several ranch hands rode out to meet them, weapons drawn. The outlaws, outmanned and outgunned, retreated into the hills. In the safety of the ranch house, as Mrs. Henderson tended to Beatrice's wound, Colton felt the full weight of what had nearly happened crash down upon him. The very scenario he had spent years trying to prevent had come to pass. His past had endangered someone he cared for, someone he loved. When he was finally allowed to see her, Beatrice lay pale but alert on the guest bed, her side bandaged and her honey-blonde hair spread across the pillow like a halo. "Don't you dare," she said the moment he entered, her voice weak but determined. Colton stopped short. "Don't what?" "Don't you dare use this as an excuse to run away again." Her blue eyes fixed on him with fierce intensity. "I can see it in your face, the guilt, the fear. You're already planning your departure." He sank into the chair beside her bed, his shoulders slumping. "They came because of me, B. You nearly died because of my past. And we survived because we faced them together," she countered. "If I had gone for help instead of returning with the rifle, you'd be dead now." The truth of her words struck him deeply. In his determination to protect her, to face his demons alone, he had nearly ensured his own destruction. "The men who killed your family," Beatrice continued softly, "they don't just take lives. They take futures, too. If you leave now because of them, they win again. They take our chance at happiness just as surely as if they'd killed us both today." Colton looked up at her. This remarkable woman who had survived the death of a husband, the isolation of widowhood, and now a bullet wound, yet still had the courage to reach for happiness. "I love you," he said simply, the words he'd held back for months finally breaking free. "I love you, and the thought of losing you nearly destroyed me today." "Then stay," she whispered, reaching for his hand. "Stay and build that life we've been talking about. Not because it's safe. Nothing on this frontier is truly safe. Stay because loving someone despite the risk is the only way to truly live." In that moment, the last thorny barrier around Colton's heart fell away completely. He leaned forward, pressing his lips gently to hers, sealing a promise more binding than any words could express. The next 3 weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Word was sent to the territorial marshal about the outlaws, and a posse managed to capture the wounded Madden and one of his companions. Justice would be served, though Colton took little satisfaction in it. His focus had shifted entirely to the future, specifically to ensuring he and Beatrice would face that future together. As soon as she was well enough to travel, Colton brought Beatrice to his cabin, properly chaperoned by Mrs. Henderson, to show her the changes he'd made. The rough shelter of winter had been transformed with a new front porch, curtains at the windows, and a small garden plot marked out nearby. "It's not much compared to what you deserve," he said nervously as he led her inside, where fresh wildflowers adorned a table he'd built himself. "It's perfect," she breathed, taking in the simple but welcoming space. "Absolutely perfect." Colton took her hands in his heart pounding so loudly he was certain she must hear it. "Beatrice Thornton, I came to Timber Creek a broken man, convinced that the only way to survive was to avoid caring, to keep moving, to never put down roots." He swallowed hard. "You showed me that true strength comes not from isolation, but from the courage to love despite knowing loss is always possible." Kneeling before her, he withdrew a small box from his pocket. Inside lay a simple gold band with a small pearl, modest, but the best he could afford after selling his best horse to the stage line. "I can't promise life will be easy. The frontier makes fools of those who expect too much certainty. But I can promise that whatever comes, we'll face it together." His voice shook slightly with emotion. "Will you marry me, Bea? Will you build a life with me here?" Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded, too overcome for words at first. Then, as he slipped the ring onto her finger, she found her voice. "Yes," she whispered. 1,000 times yes. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church of Timber Creek, with what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Beatrice wore a dress of ivory silk that Mrs. Henderson had helped her sew, with wildflowers in her honey-blonde hair. Colton, almost unrecognizable in his new suit, waited at the altar with an expression of such naked joy that several of the older women dabbed at their eyes before the ceremony even began. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, a promise to walk life's path together, through whatever storms might come. When the minister pronounced them man and wife, Colton kissed his bride with a reverence that spoke volumes about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing on the Henderson Ranch lawn. As twilight descended, Colton led Beatrice away from the festivities toward waiting horses decorated with ribbons and flowers. "Where are we going?" she asked, laughing as he helped her mount. "Home," he said simply, swinging into his own saddle. They rode together toward their cabin, now truly a home prepared for their life together. As they crested the final rise and the small structure came into view, golden lights spilling from its windows into the gathering dusk, Colton felt a sense of peace he had never known before. The man who had once believed love was a liability, that attachment only led to pain, now understood the truth. Love was the shelter, not the storm. In Beatrice's love, he had found not weakness, but a strength that would carry them through whatever the frontier might bring. As they reached their door, their threshold, their future, Colton lifted his bride from her saddle and into his arms. Against all odds, despite loss and pain and the harsh realities of frontier life, they had found in each other something rare and precious. A home not made of timber and nails, but of trust and hope and unwavering commitment. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vance," he whispered against her hair. Beatrice's arms tightened around his neck as he carried her across the threshold. "Home," she agreed, her blue eyes shining with love. "At last."